The towering remains of a mountainside structure built to withstand a colossal force.
What is it? What happened to it? What caused it to explode?
A sprawling cityscape that's been deserted and left to the elements.
It's like a giant been brought to its knees. But by what?
Strange military platforms that harbor secrets of an underwater war.
Suddenly, 200 meters from us, we were really like, oh, what is this?
And a heavyweight structure in the Eastern European countryside.
You'd be very confused if you came across it. This almost alien structure plopped down in the middle of the woods.
Once, they were some of the most advanced structures and facilities on the planet, at the cutting edge of design and construction. Today, they stand abandoned, contaminated, and sometimes deadly. But who built them, and how, and why were they abandoned? In Europe, high up in the mountainous region of the central Italian Alps, stands a large cathedral-like structure.
Towering 140 feet above the valley floor, this structure looks almost alien in the landscape. It's like a fortress from Lord of the Rings that's been brought to life. The eerie grey concrete alongside the windswept mountains makes you shiver inside.
This huge structure is set in this glorious natural setting. There's mountains, there's lakes. And as you move around the side of it, you look and go, uh-oh, what happened here?
If it were complete, it would stretch from one side of the valley right across to the other. But there's a massive gap in the middle.
Years ago, the central section of this great wall was ripped out.
Was it bombed? Was there an earthquake? This would have been an event that caused a whole lot of disruption and death.
How could something that appears so solid have failed so spectacularly?
So what happened? And is new evidence changing our understanding of its calamitous demise? The story began in the unstable years before the First World War, when Italy was struggling to catch up with Europe's major industrial powers. Progress, such as it was mainly focused in the north of the country, while the south was still blighted by severe economic stagnation. As a result, many working-class Italians moved to big cities such as Turin and Milan, which quickly became overpopulated and overcrowded. What was more, between the year 1900 and the beginning of the First World War, some 9 million, mainly southern Italians, migrated to the USA in search of a better life. Meanwhile, to speed the growth of new factories, wealthy capitalists invested in hydroelectric power stations in the mountainous region of the Alps. These are the remains of one of those projects, the Gleno Dam. But it was built in troubled times, when anarchists were occupying factories and some were even planting bombs at targeted sites.
Italy, in the north, was a place of great political unrest. You had the capitalists who were effectively under siege from a communist movement that had a whole different direction in mind. turmoil and violence, those were a day-to-day occurrence.
The man who financed the project was from the Gleno family, a family of wealthy industrialists from Milan. Gleno constantly criticized the local workers that he did employ. His preference was to use Milanese workers instead of local workers, which caused a lot of bad feeling.
So if the people that are trying to put this structure together are not working together in unison, then you are going to get a problem in the actual end product.
Building began in 1917, when the First World War was in full flow. But a few years into construction, soaring costs saw drastic design changes. And the Gleno family decided to cut corners by using cheaper, lower-grade materials.
Construction of the dam used poor quality concrete, reinforced with First World War anti-grenade netting, neither of which were appropriate for this kind of structure. Whenever any of those workers complained about those materials, they were immediately fired.
Foundations are critical to all structures. If you start to put in scrap metals, you don't really know what the composition of those metals are. They may have rusted, and so then when you're pouring concrete around that, you might not get a very good bind between the metal and the concrete. And that is really, really important to maintain the strength of the structure.
So, was it a disaster waiting to happen? In October 1923, with the dam finally built, the reservoir was filled to capacity for the first time. But problems had already begun to arise.
In the autumn of the year, there was an extremely heavy rainfall, and this caused some minor leaks in the dam that should have served as a warning, but in fact, they were regarded as, that's not a problem.
As the downpours continued, the water level soon crept above the maximum permitted depth, testing the dam's structural capacity to the very limit. By the 1st of December, it seemed to have reached breaking point.
It was just another day when the caretaker was carrying out his routine checks on the dam, and then he felt a tremor. 45 minutes later, the whole dam burst.
According to news reports at the time, there was a violent blast of air. Then water rushed down into the valley below.
Over 1 billion gallons of water suddenly forced its way through the breach at a speed of 70 kilometers per hour. A tragedy was inevitable.
The water would have been like a giant tidal wave, a tsunami with debris just rushing through the valley below, causing devastation wherever it went.
The flood wave took about 45 minutes to crash its way along down the valley. The flood destroyed 3 villages, 5 power stations, and countless numbers of isolated buildings and factories along the valley.
By the time the waters settled, over 350 people had been killed. The Gleno family and the dam's engineers were blamed, but they protested their innocence. There followed a court case, highly influenced by politics, at which conflicting and inconclusive evidence about the cause of the disaster was heard. Eventually, on appeal, the defendants were acquitted. For almost a century, this was how the story was put to rest. That was until Benedetto Bonomo, the current mayor of one of the destroyed towns, uncovered startling new evidence.
Just after the collapse of the dam, in the prison at Cremona, an inmate made a very important claim, saying that he was the head of a group of subversives who were putting bombs everywhere in what was the rising business community.
A recently discovered court document from the trial suggests that the breach in the dam was actually caused by a targeted attack.
I quickly found the document that says that the judge had actually asked the most renowned experts in the world to do a survey, which showed that a bomb had exploded there.
The survey proved that water pressure alone could never have caused the collapse. It was then revealed that 75 kilograms of dynamite had also recently been stolen from the construction site. It seemed that sabotage was the only realistic explanation.
Because of this lack of integrity between the materials and the foundations, it's possible that these explosives actually caused a much bigger event than, the saboteurs actually intended.
It could have been a disgruntled worker who wanted revenge for the Gleno family. Or it could have been an anarchist, because they were blowing up sort of power stations and power plants all around the north of Italy at that time.
But a final theory suggests that completely destroying the dam might not have been the intention at all. The plan could have been to create a small leak, which would force the dam to be decommissioned.
So no one knows for sure, but all we do know is an explosion of that kind should not have had the devastating effect that it did.
The cover-up certainly spared the government a great deal of embarrassment and criticism. A spate of bombings in the area meant they should have provided a guard at the dam.
Telling the truth 95 years later is something that hurts. People looked death in the eyes. A whole district was completely swept away. Whole families were erased. And the full story of a small village was buried forever.
Although over the years there has been much talk about repair and reconstruction, the financial backing has never materialized. And the Gleno Dam remains as it was, a reminder of a terrible disaster.
When you look at the dam today, you're reminded that it serves as a huge memorial, a memorial for ambition, but more than anything, a memorial for the hundreds of people who died when it burst.
Near the center of Detroit, Michigan, is a sprawling landscape of deserted buildings which have been left to crumble for decades. Towering above abandoned streets, this line of structures stretches for more than a kilometer.
What's most striking about this structure is its size. It seems to go on forever. It looks like some kind of industrial metropolis. A relic from a world that's long been forgotten.
It is complete devastation. Block after block after block. Roofs have fallen in, water is flowing on the floor. There is no glass in any of the windows. Nature has taken its course.
Something big happened here, almost out of a horror movie.
Inside are vast, desolate open spaces, which have been ravaged by the elements.
There's something about these cavernous, empty rooms. It's like a film set from Blade Runner or The Walking Dead.
It is an incredible place and clearly has really suffered over the years.
But what was this collection of buildings used for? And what caused this devastation and their downfall? The answer lies in the history of a product that changed the face of the United States forever: the motor car. Until the early 1900s, Most travel between cities was done by railroad, by carriage, or by steamboat. But American entrepreneurs identified a huge new mass market for an affordable, alternative means of travel. At first, development was confined to small, local areas. But it soon became apparent that mass production was needed to fully realize the potential of the exciting new invention.
In the early 20th century, the American automotive industry was very much in its infancy. Only 1 in every 10,000 Americans owned a car, and most of those were powered by steam. With its vast land area and scattered, isolated settlements, the US needed cars more than anyone.
The problem, though, was how to manufacture enough cars. Previously, factories were cramped, dingy, and dirty places. It's hard to believe now, but this facility was the start of something new.
This design completely revolutionized the space in which you could actually manufacture the cars. The workers had better conditions, and actually it improved, their morale and also their productivity.
The U.S. led the way in production in terms of number and volumes of automobiles, largely because of the factory improvements and the ability to crank out lots of cars in a short amount of time.
The pioneering company leading the charge was Packard.
Look to Packard for the easiest handling car ever built. This brilliant new Packard all but drives itself, thanks to Packard Power Steering, Ultramatic Drive, and Packard Power Brakes. America's new choice in the fine car field.
This was Packard's automotive plant. Construction began in 1903, and it soon grew beyond all expectations.
The Packard car plant was the most advanced auto factory in the world. It was built over 35 acres of land and had over 3.5 million square feet of space. It became the gold standard for car factory design throughout the US, and production rates skyrocketed.
And the secret of its success was the use of reinforced concrete. It was a material that transformed how a factory could be laid out, as local tour guide Jacob Jones explains.
We are on the ground where the Packard assembly line would have been. Moved through this entire space here at its peak, going up to the floor above us, as well as the 2 floors below. The blend of the steel and the concrete added that extra supportive strength. Is nearly unbreakable. This is where some of the finest luxury cars in modern history were built. The ones that Al Capone and Franklin Roosevelt drove. They came off of this stretch of concrete and steel right here.
But there was a problem: the price. A Packard car could cost over $3,000 when a Ford vehicle came in at just $850. So how would Packard compete? Once again, it was down to the design of the plant. With the focus on high quality to justify high prices, practically every part of every Packard was built somewhere on this site.
The 80 skilled trade departments, an absolutely massive number. Everything was so compact here at Packard that it was really easy to move parts, people, and cars really from place to place.
At its peak, the complex employed up to 40,000 workers. The company became known as producing some of the highest quality luxury vehicles in the US.
Created what was called the Gray Wolf, the first race car that was commercially available in the United States, and ultimately became a symbol of Packard's success.
During its early years, Packard went from strength to strength. But the market changed in 1929, when the Wall Street crash shattered the economy. Suddenly, the money was drying up. Would they be able to adapt to compete with the likes of Ford? So in the 1930s, Packard began to try its hand at the production of cheaper cars. Then, suddenly, the outbreak of the Second World War put the whole industry on hold.
In 1942, like other car factories, it stopped producing cars and instead focused on manufacturing Rolls-Royce aircraft and naval engines for the US and its allies.
These automotive factories shut down car production for a few years, building just over 100 cars during World War II throughout the entire country.
In many ways, the Packard car plant and other factories like it were very, very key and integral into the winning that conflict for the Allies.
The post-war years were highly competitive. The big three, Ford, General Motors, and Chrysler, still dominated the mass market. But the designs of luxury cars were rapidly changing, and Packard found itself left behind.
Popularity of Packard cars slowly declined due to its ability to not compete with other luxury car manufacturers.
They started to get a bit of a reputation for their cars not being as attractive as perhaps they could be. Some were called pregnant elephants, some were described as bathtubs. The cars were not popular with the public now.
With falling sales and its reputation taking a beating, a desperate bid for survival in the mid-1950s saw Packard move off this site for good. This great facility, which had enabled it to thrive, was left abandoned, and the company soon folded. Ultimately, Ford's style and price had won out against Packard's more expensive models. From what remains today, it's hard to imagine that this facility forever changed the way cars were built. After Packard's closure, another company occupied part of the building for a time. But without a solid ownership group overseeing the entire site, much of it soon fell into disrepair.
You look at what it's become now, and it really is a shadow of the world it once knew. It's a good example of how the mighty can easily fall.
In Eastern Europe, just over 48 kilometers from Estonia's capital, Tallinn, is a bizarre construction lying just off the coast. Stretching out across the water is a set of long concrete platforms.
Tucked away in a secluded corner of the world, no one really knew what went on there. It was all very top secret.
When we were young, playing on a beach, and suddenly 200 meters from us, we were really like, oh, what is this?
Almost no clues remain to indicate what this strange structure on the edge of the sea once was.
It's like a carcass been stripped bare by the harsh Baltic winds.
Something fairly serious, something fairly major was installed there.
This wasn't just your typical industrial commercial port.
I don't know exactly what was the building's meaning, but it goes 3 floors under the water.
But why is this place still shrouded in secrecy? And what finally caused it to be abandoned? The answers are linked to the tension-filled years of the Cold War. It began with the Truman Doctrine, announced in 1947 by President Harry S. Truman, which stated as foreign policy the US aimed to counter Soviet expansion. What followed were years of suspicion and mistrust between East and West, all of which were played out against the backdrop of the threat of nuclear war. The Cold War's most dangerous moment came in 1962, when the Soviets deployed ballistic missiles on the island of Cuba, just 140 kilometers from the US mainland. As the crisis unfolded, the Soviets deployed submarines, some armed with nuclear missiles, to hold tactical positions in the Atlantic Ocean.
One of the hottest parts of the whole Cold War was the undersea war, the submarine war. The submarine is one of the original stealth weapons, effectively. By going in underwater, it can remain invisible and get very close to an enemy shoreline, enemy naval base, launch some kind of attack.
The world was teetering on the brink of all-out nuclear war. But the waters around Cuba weren't the only place feeling the heat. Just over 8,000 kilometers away in the Baltic Sea, the action was already well underway.
The Baltic was still a really intense area of activity.
The Russians needed this Baltic area to train up and practice with their submarines and to develop better submarines and better techniques.
In Soviet-occupied Estonia, this site was built to enhance the capabilities of the Soviet fleet. This was Hara Submarine Base. Completed in the late 1950s, it was once a state-of-the-art, top-secret facility. But the battle in the Baltic was not all focused on firepower. It was also about secrecy and strategy.
Unlike a surface vessel where you designed that for speed and efficiency, a submarine you designed for silence.
The Baltic was the forefront of intelligence gathering. Submarines were creeping along the coast, morning, noon, and night, to spy on their military capabilities, to tap into communications. Were both equipped with missiles that could be used to target land sites, plus they had torpedoes for attacking warships. But I think their spying role was probably critical.
Today, the site is a shadow of its former self. But local politician Artur Talvik can still picture what it used to look like.
Everything here was full of cables. Those two quays were united by bridges with special cranes moved here back and forth, covered the ships with cables.
Hanging huge quantities of cables across the submarines is an unusual practice. This is not part of standard repair and maintenance work. So what was going on here? And how did the base help with spying in the Baltic?
The whole thing about a submarine is making it difficult to find.
The problem is it's made of steel, and any steel object moving through the water is going to generate a magnetic signature, and that can be detected.
Hara was built to solve this problem.
It's essentially a base that demagnetizes, that reduces the magnetic signature of Soviet submarines so that they can sneak up quite close to NATO naval bases and still remain effectively invisible.
The actual demagnetizing is actually a pretty quick and efficient process. Getting the submarine into the lock and lifted up, that takes all the effort.
So the submarines came in here, and then they were checked. What is the magnetic field situation?
You establish your cable system around it, you run the current through that, and that will lower the magnetic signature of the submarine, which can then go on its merry way.
With this process completed, the submarine would now be much harder to track. But this wasn't only to help it avoid detection by the enemy. These waters also contained other deadly threats.
The first need for the base like this was because of the magnetic mines. Not far away from here, 1941 was one of the biggest sea battles in all history, called the Mine Battle.
It's estimated that during the Second World War, almost 70,000 mines and other explosive obstacles were laid in the nearby area of the Baltic Sea. And it's likely that a number of the magnetic versions were still there.
A magnetic mine can sit there dormant, not being affected by anything until a ship comes. Its trigger mechanism is set to respond to the magnetic signature of a vessel coming within range, and it thus detonates.
But demagnetization only lasted for so long before the signature built up again, and the process had to be repeated. So could this one base really cope with the Soviets' needs? Or is there more to the site than first meets the eye?
The demagnetization doesn't happen only here in the quay, but also in the Bay Area. There were 18 kilometers of cables here. They spent maybe a week or even more just moving back and forth. And then they came into the harbor and measured, is the ship enough demagnetized or not?
As the Cold War progressed, Hara played a key role in the secret battle for position and information that took place beneath the waters of the Baltic. But today, with the collapse of the Soviet Union more than 25 years in the past, why is there still an air of mystery surrounding the site?
The Russians were quite paranoid about anybody finding out about their submarines. No foreigners were allowed within any distance of this.
No one was supposed to see what's going on. The fact that it was doing this crucial role in trying to reduce the magnetic signature, make submarines hard to detect, meant that it really had to be a very top-secret installation.
But these concerns didn't end with the Cold War. As the Russians withdrew and the occupation of Estonia ended, bases like this were stripped of their assets to prevent the leak of military secrets. The little that remains at Hara today offers only a glimpse into the past life of the facility. The full story of this submarine base and its capabilities will continue to remain a mystery. In Central Europe, in the northeast of Poland, is a giant concrete structure hidden from view by the surrounding woodland. Deep in the rural hinterland, this decaying object sits frozen to the ground.
You'd be very confused if you came across it. It would be very incongruous. This almost alien structure plopped down in the middle of the woods.
You've got all of that green countryside. You've got that beautiful still water. Why is there this enormous block sitting on top of it?
Whatever was once trapped inside here wasn't getting out.
When you look at it from above, you realize one thing: it's a mystery. The center is effectively a vast pool. Is it some kind of cooling tank? Is it some kind of power station? outside is a watercourse running up to it. That might be a clue.
So why build this heavyweight structure out here in the Polish countryside? And why was it left in the woods, abandoned and forgotten? The first clue to solving the mystery can be found carved into the face of the concrete.
When you're looking at the structure, you see the concrete's been bleached by time, but in the middle of it is the outline of an eagle. Now, that can only mean one thing. This building is from the Third Reich. It's a Nazi eagle.
In 1934, the Nazis began to seize control of Germany as Hitler dreamed of his new empire. In late June and early July that year came the bloody Nazi purge of the SA, its own paramilitary wing, in a series of executions which became known to history as the Night of the Long Knives. No mercy was shown as Hitler consolidated his power. Even Ernst Röhm, a long-standing friend, supporter, and ally of Hitler, was ruthlessly murdered. In August, President Hindenburg died. Hitler took on the combined roles of Chancellor and President and assumed the title of Führer. The new empire was about to become a reality. It began with the agricultural region of East Prussia, which was marooned on its own and which the Nazis recognized was highly vulnerable as tensions across the continent began to rise.
When Hitler decides that he wants his new empire to be self-sufficient, suddenly it becomes really important to grow a lot of grain in East Prussia. But East Prussia is the part of Germany that's closest to Russia.
This land was the place where the opposing sides had gone head-to-head only 2 decades earlier.
It was a very intense area of conflict and a very fought-after and sought-after region.
If Germany is going to control its own food supply in time of war, it has to be able to defend this territory.
But the inland areas barely had enough people to work the land, let alone defend it.
Despite the wishes of the Germans to have this big population in East Prussia, population didn't want to live there. A lot of them were moving out and moving away. It was a depressed farming area. So how do you populate an area? Well, you build an infrastructure. And I suppose if you build it, they will come.
The idea was to build the canal which connect Masurian lakes with the Baltic Sea. It was just a transportation channel to move the goods.
East Prussia needs transport infrastructure to get industrial farm machinery and fodder in and agricultural produce out.
This mass of concrete was to be a lock on the new Masurian Canal. These are the remains of Leżniowo Górne. The canal was planned to run a distance of 48 kilometers from Lake Mamre to the Lena River. But there was a huge difference in height between those 2 points. So locks like this one were needed.
There's 10 total locks along the canal, and they could handle craft up to 25 feet wide, being raised and lowered as the craft would move through the canal.
The remarkable thing about the lock system here is that it rises up 300 feet. When you think about that, that is a boat going up a hill and over the top and down the other side. That is what locks give us, the ability to traverse geographical obstacles that water wouldn't normally be able to flow on.
Of all the locks along the route, This was the largest, with a level difference of over 15 meters.
The Ležnje-Bogorny lock works like this. We have two different heights of water. Like the boat goes through into the lock, the gates are closed. Water is then flooded into the lock, raising the level of the boat to the next passage, and then the gate is opened and the boat passes through, proceeding along the canal.
But today, there only appears to be water on one side of the lock. Were the Nazis ever able to complete the route? It turns out they weren't the first to attempt it.
People first tried to build a canal connecting East Prussia to the Baltic Sea in the 1800s, but it's never economically feasible, and there's never enough government money to make it work.
Picking up where the previous efforts had left off, the construction also helped solve another of the region's problems.
It's really a works project. This is probably a scheme that's going to work for all of those farm laborers that were really living on the subsistence level.
But even with an army of workers already busy on the project, the outbreak of war in 1939 took Hitler's ambitions to a whole new level.
Hitler's vision goes from making Germany self-sufficient to building a continent-wide empire so swiftly that the impetus to keep building a canal in East Prussia is wiped out. The Masurian Canal is just left behind.
A few years later, in December 1944, when the tide of war had turned, the Soviet army was pushing the Germans back. In a desperate bid to slow the approaching enemy, the Nazis began blowing up the bridges over the unfinished canal.
The Masurian Canal is meant to be a piece of transport infrastructure. It never becomes that. Instead, for a very short while, it just becomes a barrier against the Red Army, and not a very good one.
Today, this abandoned structure is hidden amongst the trees, deep in the Polish countryside. But with the outline of the Nazi eagle still carved above the entrance, the memory of those dark years is ever present.
Hitler's ambition to impose his concrete industrial will on the world failed. I am seeing an attempt to dominate the green countryside of Poland turned to ruins. Hitler's 1,000-year empire didn't even last long enough to finish a canal.
Now they lie abandoned, but once they were at the cutting edge of engineering. There are echoes from history in these decaying structures. They remind us of terror and war, but also of great innovation and human endeavor.